Thank you, Tim, and good morning, everybody. I'm mindful of Tim's advice about coffee and lunch, and I have 15 minutes before we break. I'm also mindful that I generally have too many slides, so I'm going to get straight on with this. Thanks to Joel for his endorsement of CDRC. We're delighted to be able to support the DUG event today, and many of you will know about the Consumer Data Centre supported by ESRC. If you don't, then there's a brochure in the pack which you're welcome to take a look at, which updates some of the most recent material. And those of you that get bored of hearing from me can take a look at the book that you've got as well. Please take one for your friends or colleagues if you've already seen one yourself. It talks about a lot of the detailed research that's been going on in the centre over the last 5 years. And my objective in the next 15 minutes really is or 30 minutes, is to do two things. One is just to remind you about the objectives of the centre and its researchers and what we've achieved so far to date. And then to give you three very brief examples of some of the projects that I think demonstrate the ways in which we have been able to integrate hybrid data, open and more secure data, to achieve real insights into social and economic challenges and problems, but also the way in which we've been able to build relationships with data partners and bridge that divide that has historically existed between academics and commercial researchers and decision makers. And for those of you that don't recall what we were about, well, it really is that bridging role. Data owners and researchers with the CDRC providing an honest broker service in the middle. And doing a number of things, building those relationships, capacity building amongst academics to allow them to effectively use some of the new data that they're coming across from the relationships that we've established, and allowing us to work with and talk to commercial decision makers about the sorts of practical challenges that are faced in the marketplace. Secondly, technical innovation, to really explore new ways of thinking about data and analysing it, generating insight. And then thirdly, very much focusing academic attention on real-world problems in what we do. But doing it through a measured focus, if you like. And I think there are two main aims of the centre in respect of its services. One is to put as much data as we can into open. So there are three levels of data access: from controlled, which involves a Faraday cage where you leave all your belongings behind and give up your existence for about 3 hours to analyse data that wouldn't otherwise be available to you, to safeguarded, which is done through a contractual arrangement, a data agreement, to open. And moving up that line is absolutely one of the ways in which we're trying to add some value and build bridges with the academic community. And secondly, to make data discoverable. I think there is a great deal of, as we've heard so far this morning, data out there which is simply not well publicised. And that's part, I think, of our mission as well. And to generate projects of mutual benefit in the process. And how have we done? Well, over the last 5 years, the partnership, Leeds, Liverpool, UCL, Oxford, has generated a lot of good relationships, I think. What Paul Longley, I think, calls the ladder of engagement. It takes a while to build that trust with data partners, but I think we've been getting somewhere quite significant in the last couple of years in particular. And as you'll see from the brand names up there, it's not just retail brand names, it's a whole range of organisations from across commerce and industry with something to say around consumer data. And we've been busy also in terms of the amount of analysis and insight. So we have data sets now around about 10,000, 11,000 data sets, but about 54 gigabytes on the servers. Over 1/3 downloads just within the UCL, Liverpool, Oxford cluster. Over 250 projects just in the last 2 years. And the kind of capacity building courses and events, again, quite significant, nearly 1,000 event attendees over the last 2 years. So we feel we've made good progress. We feel there's a lot more still to do. And one of the biggest challenges, of course, in moving towards open is that lots of consumer data still aren't open. And that is one of the biggest challenges in moving us up that line of the graph. And that applies also to the notion of permanence of this data. that what might be open now may not be, or may not even be available. So if we think about the Obama era in the US, we have open.whitehouse.gov, which was an extraordinarily rich resource for researchers working in the US economy. This kind of happened a few years back, and then this happened. So we have, I think, some real existential challenges also to worry about open data. And there is, in some senses, almost a responsibility to ensure that we're able to mirror and capture some of these kinds of data sets and use them effectively in decision making. But I wanted to spend the bulk of my 15 minutes talking about three examples of projects that have been underway here. And I'm a bit daunted in doing so, partly because at least three of the authors are in the audience here, so they know about these projects more than I do. But that does mean that they can answer the hard questions that you may have for me at the end of the session. But I've chosen these really because they demonstrate a number of the themes we've been talking about so far this morning. They demonstrate the ability to integrate across data sets. They demonstrate the ability to be, in a sense, kind of innovative and bold in thinking about how to put data together in ways that are intellectually and commercially meaningful and generate insights. And I think they also demonstrate the benefits of the relationships that we've established over the last couple of years. And the first of these is work done by Paul Longley and Guy Lansley, who's now at Barclays. But when he was at UCL, spent a good deal of time over the last 3 or 4 years working on filling in our knowledge of population change in the UK. It's not a straightforward exercise. The mid-year population estimates do a good job of giving us the top-line data, but understanding, as we heard from Joel first thing this morning, what happens in intercensal periods in terms of some of the more detailed and nuanced variables is actually quite problematic. So can we use other sources to try and simulate or emulate these kinds of data? Can we use, for example, the electoral register? Well, we can't increasingly these days because of the lack of coverage and opting out. But can we also use things like the land registry and consumer data files held by some of the big consumer agencies to try and fill some of those gaps? And the answer is yes, but it's not straightforward. And if you're interested, some of the methodology is written up in the book here in one of the chapters. But and I'm not going to go through that in the remaining time. But what we've ended up with is, in effect, a 20-year data set where we've been able to simulate, using address matching and residence matching, the bulk of the population of Great Britain. And the way in which we've done that, I think, is through what you might call meticulous and rigorous academic analysis. We heard a comment earlier about, well, how much quality should there be in the analysis that we conduct? Is it just the appropriate level of quality? Well, when we come to data sources like this, when we're trying to, in effect, simulate the number of households and residents in the UK, we actually need to be quite high quality in terms of the methods that we employ. But if you think about how this has worked for this data set, we've managed to simulate quite closely, and I'm not sure there's a, yes, there is a line here. So the dotted line here is the mid-year population estimates. The red line is the enhanced counts that we managed to generate using alternative sources in terms of the 20-year period. So reasonably close in terms of this exercise. Now, the applications of this data are very significant, and I want to show one in a few moments. But you can get a number of variables from these linked consumer registers, whether this is household size and composition by using surnames in terms of multiple person households, about family relationships and so on. You can think about tenure, you can think about gender and age using a four names database that we have already done some work on in the last few years. And we can think about ethnicity and migration. And it's the ethnicity and migration example I wanted to point to initially. This is Spitalfields, and it's a part of London that's very dynamic. Something like 40% of the adult population was increased in the last 20-year period. About 50% have moved households between 2012 and 2016. And the percentage of Bangladeshis in that area has pretty well halved. So we need to know what's going on in between those intercensal periods that is more than can be discerned from the mid-year census estimates. So using these address and resident matching techniques, You can get at uniquely named households from this data, and we discover that something like 16,000 migrants moved into and out of Spitalfields in that 20-year period. But it's a very different movement. So what we see is actually displacement of Asian Bangladeshi by white British. And we can even look at the kinds of destinations, both in and out. So we can see that many of the migrants moving in to Spitalfields came from outside Greater London into Spitalfields as a sort of starting point for their migration through the capital. Those moving out moved to suburban locations. And we can see from this chart where some of those Bangladeshi households moved to. And quite gratifyingly, this aligns very nicely with some of the social geography that I was doing in the 70s as a student, where we heard about the way in which waves of migration move through urban areas. And this data very much upholds that kinds of transition. So this first project, I think, demonstrates the fact that we can start to fill in the gaps. It requires going the extra mile, but we can fill in the gaps between intercensal years in this way and add some real value to our understanding of local neighbourhood change. The second example is a little closer to present day, and this is some work that many of you will know has been going on using Wi-Fi data to think about footfall. And sadly, the way the presentation is displayed on the screen means we've lost some of the text lower down. But I should say that this is based on some doctoral research by UCL's Carlo Lugama and his colleagues, and it uses smart street sensor data. And that smart street sensor data is in about 80 centres with about 650 locations, using Wi-Fi data to try and understand the nature of footfall, but also to classify it. So you've seen many examples of footfall counts produced by a number of commercial organisations over the years. When you start to look at the nature of footfall counting, you discover many methodological challenges. When you use Wi-Fi data in that way, you discover even more methodological challenges. And so one of the exercises has been to clean this data, to think about things like signal strength, to think about the presence of employees with mobile phones, the locations turned on, with fridges and tills, with IP addresses and so on. Trying to clean that data is a major exercise. And again, if you're interested, the methodology is written up in one of the book chapters. But what that does allow us to do is to have greater reliance on some of this data and to start to look at patterns. And the kinds of patterns we can look at, I think, are really interesting ones. We can think about a temporal profiling of particular locations. How do the footfall patterns around particular high streets or local areas vary in days of the week in terms of type and context of centre? And certainly we can look at somewhere like Old Street, for example, and see very clearly that there are differences between, as you might expect, the weekday and the weekend in blue patterns, and through the year. And the blanks there are where the data has not been able to be collected probably because the cleaner has turned off the unit in the shop that was collecting the data. But it starts to give you a sense of emerging patterns. And then you can start to cluster these. And Carlo Lugama, in his doctoral thesis, published earlier this year, has done just that in terms of profiling these microsite locations. And you end up with probably much more reliable estimates of the kinds of profiles that we will get from footfall. 8 different categories for weekdays, ranging from the commuter and lunch, number 1, down to the simple peak, number 4, which is the midday top, we've called, through to lunchtime with minor afternoon commuter inflow. I have to say the labelling may require a little more finessing. But it gives you a sense that actually, far from the kind of 2 or 3 alternates that we've seen other commercial organisations produce, a more rigorous analysis of this data produces much more nuanced profiling of particular locations. And what we can then do, of course, if the sensor happens to be in your own outlet, is to look at that against conversion rates. And we're already starting to see that there is absolutely by no means a certain one-to-one match between conversion rates and footfall. So understanding the relationship between conversion rates and footfall gives you a real sense of when passing trade is just passing and not coming in to add to your revenue flows. So we're starting to see some really interesting exercises in this area to link back to, again, a real-life problem. My final example in the last couple of minutes is around hybrid geodemographics. And this is work done by colleagues in Liverpool, Alex Singleton and colleagues. And some of you may have seen before the work that's been done by his team on the internet user classification from 2014. We've updated this for 2018. And again, what is really interesting around this is the way in which we've been able to integrate a wide variety of sources, ranging from access to internet capacity through to the history of usage, infrastructure components such as cable broadband provision, broadband access and speed, and most importantly perhaps usage and engagement. And again, in making the cluster analysis of a profiling exercise more rigorous, going through these kinds of exercises, a framework of analysis in using both open and more safeguarded data has been necessary. And that kind of rigorous methodology is absolutely critical to demonstrate results that look superficially simple like this. What lies behind these analyses is actually, I think, a very rigorous methodological process. And that's been the hallmark of much of our CDRC work. So here we see the 2018 results for Oxford. And what this brings out is, for example, as a university city, professional occupations, many e-professionals in orange and e-cultural creators in red, but a real contrast between the centre of Oxford and Headington and the southern and eastern parts of Oxford, where we see what we might call settled offline communities, people that are absolutely happy not being online, or e-withdrawn, those that can't afford or aren't able to get access to these kinds of facilities. And so although we talk about the widespread use of the internet, we are still also very conscious of the polarization that exists between haves and have-nots, the digerati, if you like, of the UK. And here's Liverpool and Bootle with a very similar kind of contrast between intensive users and non-users. So in my 15 minutes, what I've tried to do really is to give you 3 examples of the kind of work that we've been doing over the last few years. What they have in common, I think, is their inventive use of multiple data sources at a particularly granular level. I think a rigorous and meticulous analysis and use of methods to try and arrive at something that goes the extra mile in terms of the insight it can provide. But perhaps most importantly, these could only have been possible by building trusted relationships between academic and commercial stakeholders. And that takes time to do, and it can be easily lost. So the challenge for us is to maintain and enhance those relationships and to broaden them, to give us the kind of bridge between the two communities that will add value to both stakeholders' experiences. Thank you.
I feel conscious I put a little bit too much pressure on.
That's okay, Tim, I'm used to that.
to finish on time. I mean, one of the things I do acknowledge the extra mile that you often go, and my particular experience is with the work on the linked electoral registers, where you can certainly see, having worked on those for many years in the commercial context, we've sort of put up with a lot lower quality. And certainly when you compare the way it was, if you like, good enough in a commercial context to answer some relatively broad questions, I can't remember the phrase you used in the public, but you hardened it, I think was the phrase.
Yes.
So that hardening of the data set to make it useful for social research, I think is a real benefit back to the commercial community to take on some of those observations. It was really, really beneficial. And I think the footfall data really helps with that that issue about retail sector and absolutely. The high street at the moment, which is a very important economic issue. Are there any other questions anybody else has got to ask, wants to ask? Please.
Fraser Gray from GVC. Thanks. This might be a question more for Alex Alexandros about this internet user classification and in the topic today. Sorry. In the topic today, also about that link between quality of data and relevancy, because I think anyone in e-commerce, digital marketing, it's incredibly relevant to have such a valuable data set. In terms of the quality of that, just curious, where are you sourcing this internet usage from? What sort of data sources are you using, and how are you classifying those people and clustering them as such?
So may I have to ask if he's there? Where is he? Let me answer this. So I think there's user classification, I think, comes broadly from the OII source for the national survey. And I believe it also, Paul may be able to answer this question as well, on sources of the...
Yeah, there's a mixture of sources. A number of our commercial partners provide data on online usage by their customer bases. We've done little projects on things like failed deliveries of online orders, and then there's broadband speed, there's some supply considerations, and then there's various demographic and consumer demographics that are correlates of online versus offline usage.
Okay, you've broken that down to LSOAs?
Yes, that's right. Yes, that's the basic.
And it's all available on CDRC's website?
It is.
Yes, that's right.
Yes, yeah. So, and open data. So.
Any other questions? In that case, I'm going to let you get to lunch 5 minutes early.